Land is about power, and if you are in a class that has held power for a long, long time, you naturally question the need for any change.
The problem within the Land Reform Act and the debates is that they become very, very emotive, very, very polarised.
You've got it, we want it.
I remember somebody saying, it was like a Mugabe-style land grab. I mean, come on.
I read up on community buyouts, a willing seller and a willing buyer, and there'd be sort of man hugs all round afterwards. That's actually not quite how it turned out.
Scotland is characterised by having a very concentrated pattern of private land ownership. Approximately 440-50 landowners own half of all the privately owned rural land. Scotland, until 2004, still had a system of feudal land tenure. There was growing political demands in the 70s and 80s for the restoration of a legislative assembly, a parliament. All of civil and criminal law, land law, is all decided in this place.
Scottish land reform has really gone hand in hand with the creation of the Scottish Parliament back in 1999. One of the first flagship bills that came through in 2003 was the first Land Reform Act.
Politicians thought it would be a good idea to put that right to own land by communities onto a statutory footing. They were going to underpin that by a piece of legislation that gave them the absolute right to register an interest in the land, not buy it straight off, but if and when it came on the market, they could in effect exercise a right of preemption. The genesis of all of that lies back in the 1980s and early 1990s, when there were particular cases in places like the island of Egg, where you had absentee landlords who weren't paying attention to the land they owned, who were neglecting it, and you had communities who decided that the only way they could secure greater control over how land was being used was for themselves to own it, and that's what they did.
Egg is about 5 miles by 3 miles, and we're about 12 miles off the west coast of Scotland. I moved here 40 odd years ago, and I came to work for the then owner of the island. Beautiful place to live, great place to bring up kids. I suppose it became quite obvious quite quickly that the owner at the time, he was quite difficult, and a lot of people left. And one of the main issues was lack of security. If you worked for the estate, you also lived in a tied cottage. So, house and job were linked. If you left your job, you didn't have a house.
We grew up in a caravan, but then we moved to an old croft house up the road which had a leaky roof and damp problems, and the Laird wouldn't allow the tenants to repair the buildings because they were his buildings, and he wouldn't repair the buildings himself. My parents were under a constant threat of eviction. He made similar threats to a lot of people, which obviously is a horrible way to live.
I think at that point, people said, enough's enough. We won't let people be evicted. We're sitting beside a plaque that was unveiled on the day that we actually took control of Egg. The Heritage Trust is the body that now owns the island.
A lot of people were in estate properties, which became trust properties after the buyout, and then the trust could set about trying to give people some security. There was a lot of scepticism about whether a mixed bag of ragtag poor people on a little rock in the Atlantic could do anything. It's completely ridiculous when you think about it. People want to have a good life and make things good for themselves.
Some people were saying that we'd argue like rats in a sack after 5 minutes, that we didn't have the experience or the know-how to manage a place like this. To my mind, there's nobody better to manage a place than the people who live there. Anything that we didn't know, we either found out from somebody else or we learned how to do it. Before the buyout, the population was down to 64. We're somewhere in the region of 110 now, so that's a big increase. We've now managed large projects. We knew that the community's top priorities were a new shop, a new tea room, And that's the building we see over here. We built that in the first year. It's a great building, and each of those business units are rented out to local people to run as their own businesses. Since then, we've gone on to install our amazing electric system. That was a 1.5 million project. So how the confidence and how our abilities to manage these things have increased over the years, you know. Very proud of everybody and everything that's been achieved here. We've got new people living here now, but it's also brought some of our young people back.
It certainly led to me coming back to the island. I probably wouldn't have stayed if it wasn't for broadband internet, which made it possible for me to do graphic design remotely from Egg.
Things have changed so much now with the land reform legislation and the existence of the Scottish Land Fund, where money's available. We had none of that. You know, there wasn't anywhere where we could go for advice or funding. We had to do it ourselves.
The island of Egg was handed over to its new owners in June 1997, and it became a bit of an emblem of the potential that land reform could deliver.
Well, right now we're sitting beside what's called the Immigrant Statue, and it is really, really part of our culture here. And the landowners decided to clear the straths behind the village of people in the late 1800s to make way for sheep because it was more financially beneficial to them.
There is no doubt that there is this shadow that casts over the whole of the land reform debate within Scotland. It is that 200 years, 300 years ago history.
This is part of the historic Sutherland Estate, which was all owned by one man, the Duke of Sutherland, who developed a reputation for some fairly brutal evictions. And many of those people were cleared to eke out a living in very, very small areas of land that became congested, and there was poverty and famine. And these memories are still alive in many people.
My father built the base of the Immigrant Statue. He was really passionate about his land and where he came from. My granny told me the story about her great-granny who was cleared from the strath, so that's not far away. In 2015, the land was going to be put up for sale. The landowners approached the local grazings committee and gave them first option on buying the land. A lot of the buyouts across Scotland have been aggressive buyouts where people pursue purchase, but this was offered to us, so that came as a real shock. And people were saying, oh, I'm not really sure if we should really take it on or not. And I was thinking to myself, my father, he would be spinning in his grave if we didn't take up this opportunity. It's nice to think that we're in charge of ourselves from now on. But it's not revenge for the clearances, definitely not.
Alva is a very small island off the coast of a bigger island called Mull on the west coast of Scotland. Alva has been owned for quite a long time by a relatively benign landowner, but the population has collapsed.
They do say that the only way to make a small fortune in somewhere like Alva is to start out with a large one. And obviously if you're not making money, you're losing money. We had no capital to draw down from, and we didn't want to see the place run down. Inevitably we were going to have to put it on the market.
When it became clear that the owner was considering selling it, an organisation that was already active in the northwest of Mull, already owned land, expressed an interest in acquiring Alva.
Well, when Northwest Mull registered their interest in purchasing the place, I thought, well, who the hell are they and why do they want a bit of Alva?
The main emphasis behind our company is to promote the sustainable development of this area. We're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at micro hydro generation, we're looking at creating new crofts, In fact, we've done all of those things. I was driving back from Ulver Ferry one day with Colin Morrison, our chairman, and we were sort of saying, you know, it's a sin and a shame the way that place is a bit neglected, and don't you wish we could do something about it? And then we heard that it was actually very likely to be going up for sale.
I was brought up on the Isle of Gometra, which is a neighbour of Ulver. My grandmother, who owned the island of Ulver, died in 1978, and in 1983 I got married, left the army, and became the land manager for the last 35 years or so, until about a month ago. And so that's been my home, it's been pretty much my whole life actually. I now live in Edinburgh, I've been here for 1 month. Ulver is stunningly beautiful. It's a complete gem of a place. Inevitably, if you're selling a place you particularly love, it's nice to think the new owner would be someone that would be sympathetic to your ideas of how a place would be looked after.
That's what it's all about, basically, is the island over there. What you do is to uncover this panel, and then you wait for this ferry to set off, then you pull it back across, and he comes across and collects you and takes you across to the island. There were 50, 60 people there 25 years ago, and it's down to 5 now. But there's sufficient housing there, if it's modernised, to accommodate 25 to 30 people without building a new house. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's worth looking at and working with, which is what we're now doing. Old and decrepit.
I don't quite get the obsession with repopulating a place like Ulver. If you want affordable housing, you probably wouldn't go to Ulver first because it's an expensive place to live for a start, because of the remoteness.
We live on the island of Ulver with our 2 children. He's a fisherman and I run the boathouse with my sister-in-law Emma. We get visitors to the island who are coming for walking or to see the wildlife, or just coming over for the day for lunch. The way the island was marketed as a private island and this kind of escape, and the lack of any mention of the tourism and the industry in the island, we were very concerned. We were on a month-by-month lease, so if the island was sold privately, we had no protection on our home or on our business.
We were keen to sell to someone that would be thoroughly responsible. We had certainly one particular person who I think would have made an extremely good new guardian of Ulver, with stacks of money and a very good track record. I think we had 3 viewings altogether before North Mall registered late interest, and once that was filed, essentially a lockdown.
We got a ruling that said he had to sell to us at the price agreed by the district valuer.
The district valuer came up with a figure of, I think, 4.6 million. Not as bad as we thought, not as good as we might have liked, and I think with a private buyer we'd have certainly got a fair bit more than that. That's not to say that if this particular group are going to do a good job, then I'd have been very happy with that.
So the purchase price was 4.65 million for the island. We got 4.27 million from the Scottish Land Fund, which is Scottish Government money.
Should the Scottish Government have prioritised that against, say, some of the more deprived inner cities? I think perhaps they might have got their priorities a little wrong.
It had been controversial in some circles. People assumed that that was to benefit the tiny handful of people that live on the island.
It's not just about 5 people, it's about the wider Mull community.
The tourist potential of the island is dramatic. Currently there's about 5,000 visitors a year. All those people transit past all the other places in this area that will benefit from the trade. Our whole justification to the Scottish Government is based on what can happen here in the future.
I was out looking at the sheet and I got a call from my daughter saying that Nicola Sturgeon had just announced at the party conference that Ulver community had been successful in their registration for a community buyout. And I understand there was a television camera at the ferry at that particular time. I thought it was a strange way of doing business, actually, really. The fact is, the Mull Community Council voted 7-1 against supporting the buyout. They don't want to see Ulver go from one owner that doesn't have any money to another owner that doesn't have any money. I think the SNP spin doctors decided at a fairly early stage that this was going to be a showpiece community buyout. Of course, in order to build their case, they had to make me out as being a particularly bad landowner.
I think the population's dwindled really because the lack of investment in housing, which is plain for anyone to see when they walk around.
They focused on say the old manse, which is where my mother lived.
This is the manse, which has lain empty for about 5 or 6 years. It looks quite picturesque with the sun out and the roses. It's got so much potential, but it's just been left to deteriorate. We really need to get it back into a livable state so a family can move in. I grew up in the island and there was always between 20 and 30 people. So I think we can get back to that fairly quickly once we've restored the buildings.
And this is what I thought, oh, I'm going to get that place sorted out. I think they have severely underestimated the challenges. They want to create a bigger community. Well, that's fine if they can afford it.
Million plus to invest just to do the basic work. There's going to be ongoing demands on the public purse going forward into the future.
Places that have recently been sold and have had money poured into them, and they've created employment, not permanent employment, but also poured money into the local community.
What we want is the word itself, community. So we want families to move in, we want there to be opportunities for people, we want people living here full time. I think the community can manage this better.
I wish them all the best, but I think it's a cheap shot just to do this purely for good headlines and good publicity.
When you start discussing the idea of forced sales, then it becomes hugely distressing and disturbing. It completely and utterly changes the dynamics within the sector.
We farm cows, sheep, trees and tourists. If we want to survive, we've got to diversify. We've got a 100-acre caravan park. The land's pretty poor here, and whereas I could only get about 5 sheep per acre, I can get about 8 caravans per acre, and I don't have to pay to feed them. This is Durranis Head. This was a farm on its own up to the 1940s. The traditional slate roof, local stone. Our difficulty was it was not fit for purpose for farming. We therefore looked at tourism. That didn't work. If we could have got access off the A9, we could have turned it into a cafe, but we refused access. We went to the National Park, they really weren't interested, so it sat derelict. The latest land reform thing is that the community can compulsory purchase derelict land or derelict buildings. So this is a classic place where the local community could just go in and knock the whole thing down and put up some modern housing. But because we want to preserve some of our heritage, we're sitting on it. So we run the risk of someone else exploiting it.
The 2016 Act is not solely aimed at the rural communities, it's aimed at the entire area of Scotland.
It's got the potential for delivering change for more people. There's the Action Porty buyout of the old church in Edinburgh.
There's Glasgow swimming baths that were unused that a community group got together, bought and are now developing.
Areas like Linwood.
Linwood was quite an industrialised area. It basically fell apart when the Chrysler factory shut, and the community centre itself fell to disarray. We campaigned for our town centre to be demolished, and we've now got a fantastic shopping centre that has been more than welcomed by the people of Linwood. So we campaigned then to take over the Moss Edge playing fields to then include a community centre and 3G football pitches with changing rooms. I think the Trust has obviously given people the ambition now to move forward and challenge and to actually develop things in their own rights. The Community Empowerment Act is going to give communities more control and more say over their futures.
Dumfries used to have a sort of sense of it's just a place to leave from, and the buildings are sort of locked into either the government or the boogeyman of some corporate organisation that owns it.
This building, the oven, is the very first one we hope to take over as part of our project. We've done a huge amount of work to put forward a business plan for an asset transfer that should happen this year. After we've secured Baker's Oven and started work there, we'll start to move down the block onto the other buildings down here. A lot of these are owned by hedge funds, big corporations who have massive property portfolios up and down the UK, and these are just little gems on balance sheets. Upstairs have been lying empty for a long time. The whole place has just been left to go into rack and ruin, to be quite honest. It's the heart of the town centre as well. This is what we live with, this is what we accept every day, but Dumfries is fighting back. The important thing is to get them into community ownership so we can bring something great to the town centre. We're taking control, we're coming together, and the people who live here are making something happen, and it's just such a great time to be in Dumfries.
Since we've had a Scottish Parliament, I think that's really encouraged people to think differently about what's possible.
We're no longer just a playground for the rich and famous from elsewhere in the UK, indeed elsewhere in the world, to come and do what they like here. We have some political and legal power.
If empowering people to make choices about their own lives is political, then everybody's at it, basically. It's what we should all be doing.
I always felt that, if you're going to make rules, i.e., the land reform legislation, then you stick to them, and they didn't stick to the rules, and that was very disappointing.
I'm not aware of any specific allegations that have been made in relation to Ulva about anything that's been done by Scottish ministers that's not been done in accordance with the law. The broad aims of land reform are obviously to democratise land, to make the ownership and use of land more accountable to the wider public interest.
There's nothing wrong in principle with community ownership, it's a good thing.
All the research that's been done does prove categorically that there's a much greater resilience when people own and manage the area in which they live.
The danger with this debate at the moment is you end up with this fundamental thing which is public good, private bad. And that's simply not right. There's just good ownership, there's good management, there's good use of the land. That's what's important.
There is such a lot of community development going on in Scotland in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and I can only see it being more for the future and beneficial for everybody.